Hello, everyone. Welcome again to our look into general biology lecture. We're going to look at our textbook, Chapter 2, The Chemical Context of Life. The chemical connection to biology. Biology is the study of life. Organisms and their environments are subject to basic laws of physics and chemistry. One example is the use of formic acid by ants to protect themselves against predators and microbial parasites, such as how they spray them or coat themselves. Matter consists of chemical elements in pure form and in combinations. These combinations of elements are called compounds. Organisms are composed of matter. Matter is anything that takes up space and has mass. One thing that always makes me laugh is the typical definition of matter is anything that has mass and takes up space, and the definition of mass is anything that is made up of matter. So, what is mass? What is matter? Well, you need them in their own definitions. Matter is made up of elements. An element is a substance that cannot be broken down into other substances by chemical reactions. A compound is a substance consisting of two or more elements in some fixed repeating ratio. A compound has characteristics different from those of the elements that were used to make it. For example, a single gold atom or a bar of gold will all have the same properties. However, hydrogen atoms, or I should say, hydrogen and oxygen separately have unique chemical and physical properties than they do in the combination used to form water, or hydrogen peroxide. Water consisting of two hydrogen, one oxygen atom, hydrogen peroxide consisting of two hydrogen and two oxygen atoms. Or another example, sodium, which is very explosive when it comes in contact with liquid water, and then chlorine, which is a highly toxic gas at room temperature, can come together atom to atom to form sodium chloride, which we use in table salt to either preserve foods or make them noticeably tastier. The elements of life, about 20 to 25% of the 92 natural elements are required for life. These are called essential elements. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen make up 96% of living matter, or the matter that makes up organisms. Most of the remaining 4% consists of calcium, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur. There are trace elements that are required by organisms in very, very, very small quantities, and that can often be very dangerous if they're in large quantities inside an organism. This is just a breakdown where most of those elements that our body is made out of, most of the atoms in our body, I should say, element-wise, oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen, and then some of the spare minerals from calcium all the way down to magnesium. And then trace examples could be boron, chromium, cobalt, and copper, fluorine, and iodine, many things that in large quantities can be very, very hazardous to our health, but are used on the small scale to do very specific functions. Some of them used to make certain cores of enzymes, among other functions. Evolution of tolerance to toxic elements. Some elements can be very toxic. Some species can become adapted to environments containing those toxic elements. For example, some plant communities are adapted to serpentine, a molecule or a substance that is not particularly good for most life, or used in life, I should say. An element's properties depend on the structure of its atoms. Each element consists of unique atoms. An atom is the smallest unit of matter that still retains the property of an element. For example, there could be an atom of oxygen element, there could be an atom of the hydrogen element, a individual atom of the carbon element. But atoms are composed of subatomic particles. Now, the ones that are relevant to biology are usually neutrons, protons, and electrons. Neutrons being the one that has the most mass and has no net electrical charge, protons being slightly less massive than neutrons and containing a positive charge, and then electrons, which contain substantially less mass than a proton or neutron. But an electron has just as much charge as a proton does, except that its charge is negative. And just pulling a fact from physics, a proton and an electron added together has the mass of a neutron. So neutrons are essentially a proton fused to a very tiny electron, interestingly enough. Now, neutrons and protons, they form the atomic nucleus, the center of an atom, which has a large amount of positive charge from the protons. Now, the electrons form an area of probability, or a hazy cloud of negative charge around the nucleus. And then neutron mass and proton mass are very, very closely identical, and they are typically measured in the scientific unit of daltons. Now, a cloud of negative charge. What we're looking at here is an example of a helium nucleus where there are two positively charged protons. Every helium nucleus has two protons. But in this particular example of helium, there appears to be two neutrons as well. Different isotopes of an element can have different amounts of neutrons, but the proton number is always unique to that type of element. Now, because this is not an ion with an overall charge, this is overall neutral, those two positive protons are balanced out in charge by two electrons. While electrons are typically drawn as orbiting particles, they're really more complex than that and are more accurately looked at as clouds of charge. Now, the atomic number and the atomic mass are typically present on the periodic table of elements. Atoms of the various elements differ in the number of subatomic particles. An element's atomic number is the number of protons in its nucleus, and each version of that element will always have the same atomic number. Hydrogen will always have one proton or one atomic number. Helium will always have two protons or an atomic number of 2. An element's mass number is the sum of its protons and neutrons in its nucleus. Now, different isotopes of hydrogen may have different mass numbers. For example, there is hydrogen 1, hydrogen 2, and hydrogen 3, which either has just one proton, 1 neutron, or 1 proton and 2 neutrons. Now, the atomic mass is the atom's total mass that can be approximated by the mass number, since electrons have very, very, very minute mass. All atoms of an element have the same number of protons, but many differ in their number of neutrons. A series of elements that only change in the number of isotopes are a series of the same element that have different numbers of neutrons. Radioactive isotopes may decay very quickly, giving off particles and energy. Radioactive tracers are examples of isotopes that are often used as diagnostic tools, such as in PET scans, in medicine. Radioactive tracers can be used to track atoms through metabolism. They can also be used in combination with sophisticated imaging instruments, such as whenever you use a contrast agent in MRI, CAT scans, PET scans. Those are usually radioactive material, but lightly radioactive so as not to cause harm to the individual, such as cancerous tissue that usually is more greedy for material, therefore has a higher metabolism than the rest of the surrounding material, are more likely to take up a radioactive tracer. Therefore, the parts that show better contrast on an imaging scan, on a medical imaging scan, can easily show where there's a lot of activity compared to the surroundings, which may be a sign of cancerous tissue. Radiometric dating, a parent isotope decays into its daughter isotope at a fixed rate, expressed as the half-life, or the time it takes for half the original isotope to become something else, to decay in something new. Radiometric dating, scientists measured the ratio of different isotopes and calculate how many half-lives have passed since the fossil or rock was formed. Half-lives values vary from seconds to or days to billions of years, depending on the type of isotope. Some are more stable and take many years before they break down. Some are very unstable isotopes and take even milliseconds to break down. The energy levels of electrons. Energy is the capacity to cause change. Potential energy is the energy that matter has because of its location and structure. The electrons of an atom differ in their amounts of potential energy. For example, are some electrons farther away from the nucleus or are some closer to the nucleus? An electron's state of potential energy is called its energy level or electron shell. What we see here is that a ball bouncing down a flight of stairs can come to rest only on each step, but not between those steps. For example, we have electrons that can only have certain amounts of energy. In this case, we have an electron that exists at the first energy level, which is the closest to the atomic nucleus, or we could have electrons at a higher energy level or at an energy level higher than that. But we will not have electrons with energy at levels in between, at an amount that's in between energy levels. This is called quantized energy for quantum mechanics in higher physics. Electron distribution and chemical properties. The chemical behavior of an atom is determined by the distribution of electrons in its electron shells. For example, does it have enough electrons to balance the positive charge in its atomic nucleus, or does it not have enough, and therefore is an overall positive ion, or does it have too many electrons and it becomes a negative ion, or is it neutral? The periodic table of elements shows the electron distribution of each element. Essentially, we have the periodic table, which varies by periods. That's going from left to right. The first period has hydrogen and helium. The second period has lithium all the way through neon. Essentially, what we're looking at is energy levels. What's the outermost energy level in elements of that period? But we also have groups of elements, which is those vertical columns. For example, hydrogen, lithium, and sodium, they tend to have similar properties in certain ways. Whereas things like helium, neon, and argon, they also have similar properties. And they're what are used to make, they're examples of neon gases and neon lights, which are not always made of just neon. A typical breakdown of a square in a periodic table. You'll see the atomic mass, which is approximately the number of protons plus neutrons on average in a given element. the atomic number, which is always the number of protons unique to that element, and then its elemental symbol, which can either be 1 to 2 letters. Sometimes you'll see the electron distribution diagram. For example, what are the electrons in the outermost energy level? What we're seeing here is that as we move from left to right, elements have one additional electron in order to be a neutral element. That's because they gain one proton as you move further from left to right and then up to down on the periodic table. Now, as we move from up to down, we gain an entire new available energy level. Valence electrons are the outermost electrons, and these are what are involved in most non-nuclear chemical reactions. These are the electrons that get transferred during a typical chemical reaction, whether you're dissolving salt in water or you are combusting a log in fire. The chemical behavior of an atom is mostly determined by the valence electrons. Elements with a full valence shell in its outermost energy level, they are usually chemically inert, such as helium, argon, neon, krypton, those things in the final group of the periodic table, all the way at the right. They're typically happy with the amount of electrons they have and don't usually participate in chemistry, forming compounds with other molecules, with other elements, unless there's stressful conditions like high pressure and temperature. The electron orbitals. An orbital is a three-dimensional space where an electron has a very high probability of being found. According to this textbook, that's considered 90% of the time. Each electron shell consists of a specific number of orbitals, and each orbital can only hold at most 2 electrons. Here we're getting into the quantum mechanical model. Different types of orbitals have different shapes. S orbitals are typically spherical. Pi orbitals are usually a figure 8 that is either on a particular axis. For example, a p orbital that is just on the x-axis, a p orbital that's just on the z-axis, or a y orbital or a p orbital just on the y-axis internally. And electrons will be distributed in the shapes of these orbitals. Now note that in the bottom left, you have a 1s, 2s, and 2p orbitals all superimposed on each other, essentially building up a larger element. Neon with 2 filled shells, 10 electrons. The first shell and the second shell are both filled. This is an example of a noble gas with that is completely inert for the most part. It should be noted that those examples of 2p orbitals, there are 3 in total, and they are often drawn separate, but they do exist on top of each other. But an electron will be in a specific one of those. The formation and function of molecules depends on chemical bonding between atoms. Atoms with incomplete valence shells can share or transfer valence electrons with certain other atoms. Sharing forms covalent bonds, transfer forms ionic bonds. These interactions usually result in atoms staying close together, held by attractions called chemical bonds. A covalent bond is the sharing of a pair of valence electrons between 2 atoms. In a covalent bond, the shared electrons are counted toward each atom's total valence number. For example, 2 hydrogen atoms. Each hydrogen atom has 1 electron orbiting on the outside. But as those individual hydrogen atoms come closer together, they form a covalent bond where where an electron from both atoms is used to form a covalent bond, or a shared density of electrons. Therefore, a covalent bond is made from 2 electrons. And that's how we get the molecule molecular hydrogen. 2 hydrogen atoms chemically bond together covalently. A molecule consists of 2 or more atoms held together by covalent bonds. Molecules are made through covalent bonds specifically. A single covalent bond is called a single bond, and it's a sharing of 1 pair of valence electrons. A double covalent bond is shortened to a double bond, and it's formed through the sharing of 2 pairs of valence electrons. Each bond needs 2 electrons to form. You'd have, more often than not, nature shows single, double, and triple bonds. However, there are examples of higher bonding in a field called inorganic chemistry, which involves transition metals to form quad bonds and quintuplet bonds and further beyond. The notation used to represent atoms and bonding is called a structural formula. What we see here in the top is 2 hydrogen atoms with a single bond drawn between them. That dash represents 2 electrons. This can be abbreviated further within a molecular formula, where we just ignore the bonds and draw how many of each atom is present in that molecule. That subscript number 2 says that that molecule of molecular hydrogen has 2 hydrogen atoms in it. What we have here are examples of molecular hydrogen, molecular oxygen, water, which is from 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom, and methane, which is 1 carbon and 4 hydrogen atoms. What we're seeing here in methane is that carbon forms 4 bonds, 1 bond to each hydrogen atom to form its overall structure. Now, the bonding capacity is called an atom's valence. Covalent bonds can form between atoms of the same element or atoms of different elements. A compound is a combination of 2 or more different elements, such as water. There's hydrogen and oxygen, 2 different elements. Compounds can have much more than 2, though. Atoms in a molecule attract electrons to varying degrees. Electronegativity is an atom's attraction for the electrons in a covalent bond. The more electronegative an atom is, the more strongly it pulls its shared electrons towards itself. So if there are electrons in a chemical bond, those electrons will be pulled closer to the element that has a higher electronegativity, such as between hydrogen and oxygen, the bonding electrons will be closer to oxygen. In a nonpolar covalent bond, the bonded atoms share electrons relatively equally, whereas in a polar covalent bond, there's an uneven sharing of electrons, where they're closer to the more electronegative atom or element. Unequal sharing can result in partial positive and partial negative charges. The more electronegative atom has more electron density around it, therefore it has a slightly negative charge, and the less electronegative element in a bonded set is has less electron density around it, therefore it's slightly positive in charge, such as in the case of water, where the hydrogens are slightly positive and the oxygen is slightly negative, because the bonding electrons between each hydrogen to the oxygen are closer to the oxygen. Atoms sometimes strip electrons from their bonding partners, or an electron transfers from one element to another. An example is the transfer of an electron from sodium atoms to chlorine atoms, which forms positive sodium ions and negative chloride ions. The transfer of an electron, both atoms now have an unbalanced charge because there's no longer an equal number of electrons to nuclear protons. A charged atom or charged molecule is more correctly called an ion. For example, sodium, which usually has one electron, one valence electron in its outermost shell, can give that electron to a chlorine atom, which normally, as a neutral atom, has 7 electrons in its outermost shell. Therefore, sodium has one less electron than the total number of protons in its nucleus, therefore it has a positive 1 charge, and chlorine now has an additional electron, one more than the number of protons in its nucleus, therefore it has a negative 1 charge. And because one is positive and one is negative, they'll be attracted to each other through electrostatic charges. Therefore, there's not a shared chemical bond between them, but a bond through charge. When a positive ion is formed, that ion can be called a cation, and then a negative ion would be called an anion. And an anion and ionic bonds are the attractions between anions and cations. Compounds formed by ionic bonds are called ionic compounds or salts. An example of a salt being sodium chloride, table salt, often found in nature as crystals. Unique to ionic compounds is that they'll form these lattice structures. Weak chemical interactions. Most of the strongest bonds in organisms are covalent bonds that form a cell's molecules. Many large biological molecules are held in their functional form by weak bonds. For example, a protein that has many folds, the actual protein chain is held through covalent bonds, but the different way that it folds in on itself is usually held through weaker bonds that are charge related. The reversibility of weak bonds can be an advantage. Now, an example of bonds includes hydrogen bonding. A hydrogen bond forms when a hydrogen atom covalently bonded to one electronegative atom, such as oxygen or nitrogen, is also attracted to another electronegative atom. In living cells, the electronegative partners are usually oxygen and nitrogen. So a hydrogen on an oxygen in a hydrogen bound chemically bonded to an oxygen might be electrostatically attracted to an oxygen on another molecule, simply because of those partial positive and negative charges. Here's an example of ammonia. Ammonium hydroxide is really just ammonia dissolved in water. The partial negative charge on the nitrogen ammonia will be attracted to the partial positive charge of hydrogen in water, or to itself. Therefore, partial negative charges are attracted to partial positive charges. These are not chemically bound together through the sharing of electrons, but are merely attracted to each other and held in place by their attraction through charges. There are van der Waals interactions. If electrons are not evenly distributed, they may accumulate by chance in one part of a molecule. Van der Waals interactions are interactions between molecules that are close together as a result of these charges. Collectively, such interactions can be strong, as between molecules of a gecko's toe hairs and a wall surface. A molecule's size and shape are key to what function it has. A molecule's shape is determined by the positions of its atoms' orbitals. Electron orbitals. In a covalent bond, the s and p orbitals may hybridize, creating specific molecular shapes. Those molecular shapes or molecular geometries are essentially what we're seeing in the top right, where we see a sort of tetrahedron overall molecular geometry, or a four-pointed pyramid. These molecular geometries are formed through the hybridization or the combination of multiple atomic orbitals to form multiple hybridized orbitals. Although this subject is more appropriate in a chemistry course. Now, as those atomic orbitals combine to form molecular orbitals, that forms molecular shapes or geometries. These determine how biological molecules recognize and respond to one another. Opiates, such as morphine, are naturally produced endorphins. And naturally produced endorphins have similar effects because their shapes are similar to each other, and thus they bind to the same receptors in our brains. Thus activating the functions of those receptors. Chemical reactions are the making and breaking of chemical bonds. The starting molecules of a chemical reaction are called reactants. The final molecules of a chemical reaction, or what are made after the fact, are called products. Usually a chemical reaction is written as the chemical formula of each reactant, which may be one or multiple, and then an arrow that points to the right, which means yields, and then the chemical formula of the products. Now, the subscripts in a chemical formula say how many of that element are in one molecule of that molecule. For example, H subscript 2, one molecule of molecular hydrogen has 2 hydrogen. H2O, one molecule of water has 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. Now, based off of the principle that matter cannot be created or destroyed, in non-nuclear chemical reactions, the amount of each element you have on the reactant side must equal the amount of each element on the product side. For example, if a chemical reaction results in 2 water molecules or a total of 4 hydrogen atoms, there must be a total of 4 hydrogen atoms present on the reactant side. To balance the number of elements, to balance the number of each element on both sides of the chemical equation, that's why we have these larger numbers in the fronts of chemical formulas. For example, there is a large 2 in front of H2 on the reactant side. There is a large 2 in front of H2O on the product side. That says how many of that particular molecule is needed for this chemical reaction to occur. So 2 molecules of molecular hydrogen reacts with 1 molecule of molecular oxygen to form 2 molecules of water. Those large numbers are called stoichiometric coefficients. Photosynthesis is an important chemical reaction. Sunlight powers the conversion of carbon dioxide and water to glucose and oxygen. Water, now, typically this is not necessary to remember the whole thing, but 6 molecules of carbon dioxide react with 6 molecules of water to form a single molecule of glucose, C6H12O6, and 6 molecules of molecular oxygen. The stoichiometric coefficients usually are not remembered in every single class. It depends on your instructor. Leaf bubbles of oxygen bubbles of leaves underwater. All chemical reactions are usually reversible. Most chemical reactions are reversible. The book is incorrect here in saying that all chemical reactions are reversible. Products of the forward reaction become reactants for the reverse reaction. If a reaction is reversible, then when you produce products, those products might be able to go backwards to form the original reactants, which in that case, you would change which one is the product and which one is the reactant. The two opposite-headed arrow indicates a reversible reaction. Chemical equilibrium is reached when the forward and reverse reactions occur at the same rate, essentially as 1 unit of reactant is used, forming 1 unit of product. 1 unit of product is used to go backwards and form 1 unit of reactants. At equilibrium, the relative concentrations of reactants and products are no longer changing, because as a little bit of reactant is used up to form products, a little bit of product is used to form reactants. Therefore, the concentrations stay effectively the same at equilibrium. Studying biochemistry is a holistic way. In a holistic way is going to be the key to the answers we need. That was by Dr. Lovell Jones, who works in his lab where he has studied the relationship between hormones and cancers that may result, or cancers, how they affect hormones, such as how hormones may be produced more in thyroid cancer, among others. What we're looking at here is, let's see, this is just a figure of fraction of isotope remaining in fossils versus how many half-lives it might take to get to that fraction. All right, so right now we're just looking at different figures. All right. Example of sunlight energy used. Captured. Sunlight energy is captured during photosynthesis to form chemical bonds that make glucose and molecular oxygen, which can then be used later. All right, more figures. No representation of atoms bonding together, and then ionic bonds. All right, these are examples of covalently bound structures. Nice and nice. The one on the left is an example of a structure that is possible. The one on the left is an example of a structure that cannot actually occur in nature because hydrogen cannot bond more than once. It can only ever form one single bond with something else. So the thing on the right is definitely non-existent. All right, moths, beautiful. Beetles, nice. Bombardiers. All right, that concludes Chapter 2 of General Biology. Glad to have you all again, and peace.